I was talking to my therapist about kind of nerves about the book coming out and sort of the sort of weirdness of the imagination, and it's graphic and it's violent. She was like, "Oh, you're tapping into the universal consciousness." And I was like, "Yes, that's right," and like that was quite comforting, and so it's hard. It's like hard to talk about this in a way that doesn't sound ridiculous in some ways, but it also felt like very powerful.
MacLaughlin is the author of the acclaimed memoir Hammerhead, The Making of a Carpenter, and has written for publications including the Paris Review Daily, The Believer, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. Her recent book, Wake Siren, Ovid Resung, is a reimagining of the Metamorphoses, Ovid's epic, poetic history of the world through hundreds of mythical transformations. French-Indian poet, dance producer, curator Karthika Nair is the author of several books. Her poetry has been published in Granta, Prairie Schooner, Poetry Magazine, and the Blood Axe Book of Contemporary Indian Poets. In Until the Lions, she retells the Mahabharata through shifting poetic forms. This is the Mahabharata distilled, one of the longest and most complicated epics, masterfully, succinctly retold through the characters on the periphery. I'm so pleased to have them both here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Nina and Karthika.
Just to give you a lay of the land, we're both going to read a little bit and then sort of talk. And so, as Shuchi said, this is a reworking of the Metamorphoses, and I'm going to give you guys a quick story here, the story of Pygmalion, which is probably, I don't know, maybe Pygmalion is famous for carving a woman out of stone and her coming to life. And it's one of the stories in the Metamorphoses that is sort of told and retold many, many millions of times, a lot of different interpretations. My Fair Lady, Pinocchio, the movie Mannequin, which I really loved as a kid and watched many times. All these sort of different ways of seeing this old story. So this is that version here. Pygmalion hated women. He thought they were disgusting. Their voices, their laughs, their hairs, the way they sweat, smelled, stepped. "You Cyprian women get so wet," he said. "What's with that?" No one told him. No one told him what the wetness was. "So it don't hurt? Because we like it?" A way of saying, getting there. A way of saying, ready. A way of saying, more. A welcome, a compliment, an invitation. Between the fingers it spreads like thread, a glow, a word, silm, the shimmer. You know how lucky to feel that from a woman on your knees. The rivers, the ocean, the rain, tearfall. The rivers that do not make it to the sea. The ocean that's absorbed again by the skin, wash of brine on the body. The rain before it reaches the earth to evaporate. Tearfall, unfallen. Detour, the moisture. But it's not like water at all. Moves better than blood. It's got its own light, and the light is a mystery. Have you ever even made out with a mango? You feel it on the inside of the thighs and not know what sort of prize that is? That's another thing entire when it gets to the legs. What's with that? There's so much that we want, and otherwise we drown. You Cyprian women get so wet, disgust dripping off his tongue, so he carved one dry as stone. Oof, you're perfect, he cooed. She's mute as he groped her ivory breast. He clasped necklaces around her neck, beads and jewels between her breasts. He placed her in his bed, stiff. Under the covers he warmed the stone. Cold toes, he'd say. Women knew he hated women. Women know when a man hates women. It hides in their smiles. It hides in the smiles of surprise each time a woman shows she's funny, strong, or wise. The men who hate women are surprised at this. Pygmalion hated women, and all the women knew. A man who hates women builds one with a juicy ass and giant tits and no belly and a face that's foreign and empty and dumb. And when Pygmalion begged Venus to make her real, and Venus granted his request and put moving blood in her body and gave her breasts that squished if you gripped them, we teased her, but only because we wanted to make her know. Where's your stretch marks, sweetheart? Where's your period? Where's your laugh? Don't you laugh? Where's the one hair at your nipple? Where's the flesh crease on your back? Where's your smell, sweetheart? Don't you smell, sweetheart? Where's the strength in your legs? Where's the muscles in your shoulders? Where's the wetness? Where's the rivers, ocean, rain, tearfall? Where's your power, sweetheart? We'll tell you, sweetheart. It's in you, sweetheart, all over you. It fills every curve and swell. Find it, sweetheart. Know it, sweetheart. He doesn't make you who you are. Time separated her from her statue life. Smell this, she'd say, and lift her arm. We laughed. You got it, ivory girl, you stink. She sweat and seeped like all of us, less perfect every day. There's nothing duller than perfection. She'd learned. Really, it's a myth. That's right. We loved her more and more. There is no love in loving the ideal. Piggy doesn't love me. He loves an idea in his brain. Piggy is a shit. She knew it. We're made of mess, she said. Sweetheart, yes, that's exactly what we're made of. Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you for the welcome, Shuchi, and thank you for the reading. So like Shuchi said, this is a book that retells the Mahabharata through a multiplicity of voices, most of them quite peripheral. And one of the acts of reclaiming is that the central narrative is told in the voice of Satyavati, who's the mother of Vyasa, traditionally considered the author of the Mahabharata. And quite early in the book, she situates, she positions herself. It's a series of poems called Fault Lines. Listen, listen, this neither begins nor ends with me, not such a hate cascading down time, crossing sea and sky and continent, a hate that sails beside friendship, love, fealty. So many skiffs. I could not say where it began, perhaps only the stars can, for beginnings come clothed in mist. There are many who will claim to know, Vyasa foremost, but even saintly bards, especially when sons, don't allow tales to travel unadorned. And so I must uncage the quieter lore, let them wander, rags and slander notwithstanding. There may be rhyme, but not much reason, little meter, but both stress and distress. This is not the whole story, nor a lyrical history of mankind. It is what I know to be mine, true or nearly so. Perhaps not at all at times, for truth is a beast, more wayward than time. And now I'll move to one of the peripheral narratives. It's a poem called Bedtime Story for a Dasi's Son, and it's in the voice of a maid who remains mostly unnamed in the Mahabharata. I call her Sauvali, and she's a maid who's taken by the king for pleasure, but also with the express intent of having a child, because his own wife's endless pregnancy leaves him in a desperate situation. He thinks that his brother is going to produce an heir before him. So this is Dhritarashtra's maid, Sauvali. When the king decides to, it is time. Say it, say it, say the word. A word A voice resounds in my head. Not yet, though, for a word is more than a word, and before it shrapnels my child's ears, he must know its shape and color, its texture, its smell, so he can hold it, so he can wield it. When the king decides to take you, the contours of your life dissolve. You move within a cage of eyes, the unkindness of eyes that define every action, surround you from daybreak to daybreak, from plunder to cleansing to respite to plunder again. Your deflowering, too, is a public act. The bedchamber is not naked, nor is the king. Only you are. Your deflowering, accompanied by priestly chanting and conch shells, unfolds in 3 long acts of lunge, grind, rip. The lunge of a Himalayan thing that blots out the night, ferrous hands and knees that unhinge limbs, prying open arms and thighs, no flesh or thought, all metal and sweat and rush. The grind of chest against belly, the grind of seed bags on sepals, the grinding of a back into gravel against silken sheets that singe skin and memory. Rip, the fine robes you were made to wear. Rip, the fragrance of young lips. Rip, softness from both breasts. Rip, the muslin of a heart hidden between 2 hips, its walls fluid and dark and furious. Darkness bellows and overflows till you feel no more. But you wake, all too soon, and when you wake, the king has recommenced, so have prayers. At first you know no anger, no fear, only pain that permeates from skin to marrow. Your spine is bent, bone after bone, with the weight of a tungsten sky. Your breasts have aged, the nipples turn to rust. Mouth and tongue swell into rubble and dust. Your back and neck bear the hieroglyphics of talons. Deep and live and rubescent, the kingdom's untold history. Your belly is a molten, screaming pit that cannot be hushed. When the king decides to rape you, no one will use the word rape. The word does not exist in the king's world. Your body is just another province he owns, from navel to nipple to eyelid, insole to clitoris. And it is not over yet. Time moves from night to night, from one coupling to the next, for you are to be pounded till you procreate. Each night he comes to peel and split you open like a tangerine. Suck dry, then discard all thought of you except the seed. Each night you must try to be pliant, for a king's displeased voice can sever heads. Each night you curse the queen whose unending incubation has forced you to her husband's bed. Each night you pity the queen whose husband knows no tenderness, no love in his loins, save for a son and heir. Each night.
That's amazing. And I was going to start somewhere else, but I actually, since you read that passage, this idea, the repeated word of deflowering, I thought about this a lot too in Ovid and you know, the Odyssey and these works that have been translated primarily by men for generations. It's the euphemism used, you know, deflowering, attained her love is a big one. And I wonder, is that true here? And were you seeing that in some ways, like the word rape doesn't exist for this? Like, is this in some ways, do you see it as a corrective?
That particular chapter is actually also in reflection of a lot of things that go on, because specifically in India, there's marital rape is still not a crime.
Wow. Yeah.
It was a reminder more than a corrective that this is it's something that, you know, we were discussing, that these are in many ways timeless narratives.
Yeah. And that sort of makes me think, I was reading a conversation between a writer named Tashani Doshi, a poet who we both know, and you are also heavily in the world of dance, and you guys, so is she, and you guys were talking about dance as an act of resurrection and revival. And I was like, okay, is that what these projects are too? And then I was sort of thinking, for me, it doesn't feel like that, because it feels like these stories are still so alive. But I wonder if that was the same for you.
Yeah, I think it wasn't so much a revival as a desire to fill in the interstices and to complete the silences. So the way I see it, I haven't written anything original. It's hence the subtitle of the book, which is Echoes from the Mahabharata, because as with the Greek and Roman myths, the South Asian foundational epics have been told and retold since the beginning of time. There's tellings which go back 2,000 years and which were already subversive, which were already talking from various different perspectives. So that's a huge wealth of literary resistance in my eyes, and which one is constantly in danger of losing, because there's a desire for a single narrative, especially with rising forces in religious conservatism, which then spills over into the political arena and so on and so forth. And the body is the first thing to reclaim, which is, I think, something you do magnificently.
Thanks.
Because I was reading and rereading Wake Siren, and I think it does many extraordinary things, but the most singular is that it perhaps this sounds obvious because Ovid did call it Metamorphoses, but I think what struck me with the heft of a sledgehammer is just how physical your book is, and how each of your voices owns that physical space and comes alive in the individuality of texture and touch. This is a book of touch. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. That's neat to hear. And I think, it's funny, the book that I wrote before this memoir, it took me like 3 years to write, and 7 drafts, and took a long time, and came from this very like tight place in my brain. And writing this, it happened very quickly, like 3 months. And and it's like, and the only way that I know how to describe it, it was like a bodily event, that it was like, it was like I was writing from the neck down, which I really haven't had an experience like that in my writing life before. And so I was sort of getting the same vibe from you reading it. Like there was something coming through you, and I feel the same way when I read this out loud, that there's something like coming through, which sounds like ridiculous, but in terms of texture, I was actually thinking about this recently, because on my desk there's like a bunch of feathers, and there's like seed pods with spikes, and some dried yarrow, and like all this different like actual tactile texture. And I think as I've gotten older and walk around the world, I feel much more attuned. Like I'm less sort of grinding about boring whatever crap in my brain, and like looking at the textures around me. And so it's really neat to hear you say that word with this. And I feel like, and I would like to hear too the sort of like physicality, because there's this moment in the introduction here where you're talking about the idea, when the idea came from you. I'm just going to read it because I think it's so great. Strange things happened that day. Axons were galvanized, synapses broke apart, then rewired themselves. The pulse screamed. It was painful, visceral, thrilling. And like, that's great, man. That's like, that is the best stuff. And I wonder if you could talk, I don't know, a little bit about that moment and how that sort of informed the project.
Actually, that is, you're right, that's the genesis of the project. That's when I thought, this is what I want to do. But those very physical, biochemical reactions were to reading what I think is a masterpiece of 20th century literature, which is the great modernist poet Arun Kolatkar's slender, ever so slender, but incendiary telling of the Mahabharata called Sarpasatra. So there's this book which is much less than 100 pages, and he tells the epic entirely through actually the episodes that bookend it in the epic, which is the snake sacrifice that the descendant of the Pandavas, so traditionally the heroes, offers, or rather the sacrifice that he claims from the entire species of snakes. And all this to avenge his father Parikshit's death. In the Mahabharata, it serves as a framing device because that's when the earlier epic is told to him. But for Karthika, that becomes center stage, and he tells it mostly through the voice of Jaratkuru, who is one of the snakes watching and experiencing the sacrifice. She knows she's going to be pulled into the fire, and her son is the only person who can stop this. And to read something which was a literary masterpiece, but also is a huge political statement, even though I am not sure how much Karthika intended it to be one. He was very quiet about his politics, but I think his books speak for themselves. It felt like nothing could go beyond that, and the attempt wasn't to go beyond that. It was sort of to doff my hat at him, and then I said, what do I want to do? This is what I want to do. The voices that are not even sometimes named in an epic are the ones that I want to try and channel, and yeah.
Right, and so that's like the idea of channeling feels very compelling. Like, and how did you sort of provoke that channeling?
I think through immersion. For 2 years, so this is the exact opposite of the 3 months. It took me 2 years to actually dive in. I did nothing but read translations, tellings, adaptations, watch stage performances, films from absolutely epic films to schlock, really bad, very very kitschy versions. And everything taught me something. So mine was a very progressive in terms of gradual kind of immersion, and I needed to do that. And initially, the voices came very slowly because there was this whole thing of inhabiting. We both were in the same residency at different times of the year, but so the first poems were written around the time I was in Sangam House, and I actually plotted out the structure because I think that was the most difficult part. I'd written these initial poems, and several people who were kind enough to read those poems, the wonderful poet Marilyn Hacker being one among them, said, this is, this works as individual voices, but how are you going to string it together?
Yeah.
Do you not need, because all of us, even those of us familiar with the Mahabharata, tend to forget minor characters, we tend to forget chronology. It is probably the world's longest epic. It's 100,000 couplets.
Wow.
Yeah, in its shall we say current form. Maybe initially it was just 50,000 because it's believed that the original was mainly about the war, and then you have sections that are added, redacted, expanded, etc. Anyway, it is a very long epic, so everyone forgets certain parts of it, and that's how the Satyavati voice, which I began with, came to being, because I didn't want a framing device that was exterior to the book. So once that happened, things became more natural.
That makes sense. And one of the things I really appreciated about it, and it sort of happened for me in a natural way, was that there is this like elevated poetic language here. I mean, there's sort of this what I kind of consider this epic register, and then there's words like schlong, and it's like, yes, I love it. And I think the thing is, when you're reading a translation and there are those sort of anachronistic words that can really throw you out, and I think one of the things that's so exciting to me is that with this and these sorts of projects is that those words, it wasn't jarring. It wasn't like, oh, I'm out of it now. It was like, yes, this feels totally of a piece of what you're up to. And I wonder, I don't know, someone had asked me, like, how aware have I been of like moving back and forth between this sort of elevated language and the sort of more like colloquial speech. And for me, it happened quite naturally. It was sort of just listening to these women speak in my mind. And sort of I could hear them, some spoke in this sort of ancient way and some spoke as we would speak together. And I wonder for you if it was like, if that sort of naturally like this sort of in and out of colloquial and sort of more poetic, was that a deliberate choice or was that sort of an unconscious way of going about it, sort of natural for you?
I think it depended on the voice because each time I was trying to inhabit, God, that sounds kind of, it sounds a bit like a medium or something, and I don't.
Yeah. That's. I feel the same way. Totally. Yeah. Like I sound like an idiot.
I was trying to inhabit the soul of each character, which was the only way I knew how to approach this. So the slang comes in very often in moments of heightened emotion, or when it felt like the women and sometimes men in question needed to be uncensored, even in the environments, especially in the environments they were working with. And so it was my only attempt each time was to be faithful to who they were in that moment in the story.
Yeah.
And it's funny you should say this because that's something I wondered a lot about with Siren. Some of it is the characters are very self-conscious, or rather self-aware, not self-conscious, of their environments, and you feel like they could be standing on a street somewhere today, and they're talking about a world that is clearly rooted in the today, and there are others which are totally intemporal.
Right.
How did you navigate between those two, and was it the characters or the stories which predicated those choices?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So it's funny when you read through the Metamorphoses, a lot of these stories are like, it's the same thing over and over again. Like nymph gets chased and to prevent getting raped, she's turned into a tree or a rock or a spring over and over and over again. And so reading through, partly it was looking for like what differentiates each of these women, and like they're most of the time it was like one tiny detail, it's like, she's wearing a white headband. And so for me, it was like, okay, this white headband, and like what associations does that sort of conjure for me? And sort of letting those sort of details, like letting my brain sort of fill in the rest. And during the time that I was working on it, I was going for these really, really long runs, and I would read a story and then just kind of, just like listen to the voice, and some just sort of presented themselves as modern, and some felt like, oh, this is something that's going to be landed in sort of a more atemporal time, sort of, or like a mythological time. And it was like, whatever the sort of details were just kind of like, I don't know, bringing my brain to those places. And it's hard to explain. It's like, I don't remember writing a lot of it, and this idea of channeling or inhabiting, it's like, I say these things, it's similar. I'm just like, God, Nina, like, but it's like, that's what it felt like, it was just like, okay, these, it's like coming through. And I was talking to my therapist about kind of nerves about the book coming out, and sort of the sort of weirdness of the imagination, and it's graphic and it's violent. She was like, oh, you're tapping into the universal consciousness. And I was like, yes, that's right, and like that was quite comforting, and so it's hard. It's like hard to talk about this in a way that doesn't sound ridiculous in some ways, but it also felt like very powerful.
Your characters also kind of talk to each other, between chapters. There's a really interesting back and forth happening, because sometimes they're witnesses to each other's metamorphoses, but also the trauma that precedes that, like Scylla with Echo, or Semele with Echo, primarily. And I wondered, was there, okay, this is going to sound a little more deliberate than I think what the writing process was perhaps for both of us, but did you know that there would be these conversations, or did they just happen completely organically?
It was, that's a neat question too. I mean, some of it would be like reading through the Ovid and then realizing after the fact, like, oh, like there's this connection here. Like there's a story that's a heavy one. Mira is sort of in the way this appears in the book is in sort of a session with her psychoanalyst, and she's talking about like wanting to have sex with her dad, and it's a heavy one, and her son is Adonis, and what I realized afterwards is that her grandparents is Pygmalion and his wife, and Pygmalion, the story that I read when I realized this, I was just like, oh my gosh. And there are these subtle sort of like connections that felt like thrilling to me, so it was more like I felt lucky when I realized them, and it wasn't that sort of conscious awareness, but I was like, oh wow. And like realizing that Pygmalion was the grandfather of Mira, who's the mother of Adonis, with her dad, this is just like wow. Yeah.
And Mira is a great trigger, because one of the things that's a really it's a really tough chapter, I think, to write, but it's very compelling to a reader. And I did wonder, you've avoided something which I think is quite remarkable. You've avoided the desire to make her likable. Was that tough?
Interesting. Interesting. Did you find her unlikable?
I found her, no, I did not find her unlikable, but I found her own preoccupation with appearing monstrous.
Yes.
Really, really fascinating.
Right, okay, interesting.
You know? And because that runs through the entire narrative. She is so conscious of the monstrosity of her own desire. But at no time does she attempt to exculpate herself.
Right.
And I found that a very, very, very singular approach for a writer, especially a writer who's reclaiming a very male narrative, and you don't at all try to excuse that.
Yeah. That's, I mean, again, and that was not a sort of conscious or maybe it was unconscious. Like, I think that, I guess it's like, in thinking about, okay, this is this kind of like, this sort of repugnant, like, horror of a desire. Like, how would she, like, wanting to be kind of, wanting the psychiatrist to be like, yes, I see, like, you are a monster, wanting it to be verified for herself, like reinforced, like that it's like almost this idea. And I think this kind of like goes through a lot of these stories, this idea of like, am I crazy? Like, am I wrong? Am I mistaken about what I'm feeling right now? Like, was it actually as bad as I think it was? And I think that's I think what a lot of these figures reckon with, like, not getting their stories told, sort of like, oh, like, was I overreacting, and needing that sort of like, no, in fact, no, I don't know. I would love, there was a chunk I would love to hear you read out loud, just hearing also like how beautifully you read before, which was on page 52, 53, if you wanted to just read a chunk of that. Because it's like, you guys should all get this book. There's something like the rhythms of the sentences, the cadences, really just like, there's a lot of different characters, and I don't think you have to have familiarity with the original text, which I definitely don't, to really just kind of be drawn along on the rhythm of these sentences.
So this is Satyavati again. There's a lot of Satyavati in the book. She's pretty much the only person who sort of takes the narrative forward in a linear way. And this is the part where she's become queen, and she's done all these rather horrible things to ensure that her heirs have the throne, that she creates a dynasty, and then she's in the awkward and very unexpected, unbearable to her position of a son who's totally useless, who's dissolute, who doesn't want to get married, who doesn't want to produce kids, who just wants to have fun. And she's appalled because she's done all these things, and she's quite aware of just how horrid they are, to ensure that, her children have the throne. And so she's talking about her own son. Listen, the boy had no regal pride, no thirst to bestride the realm or age. This prince preferred to drink himself into tuneful trance, chase palace maids, unleash verse in free torrent. Such is the nature of Karma, of her silent, sinuous dance. When proclaimed king, my son handed sword and scepter back to his sibling. Yes, to Bhishma, whose fate I had deviated. I coaxed, I sneered, I berated. I even found tepid, shameful tears to shed. In vain, Vichitravirya would not budge. He hadn't wished, nor judged himself set to be monarch. He said, that may be our whim or will, but not one he would indulge, at least not just yet. Besides, he remarked, diving for safety within time-tested sutra, didn't Dharma dictate he swim in his elder brother's wake? The forefathers would never forget such immorality. Wouldn't his own Atma be at stake were he to snatch Bhishma's birthright? I could have killed him at that, flesh of my flesh or not, that ingrate, humbug, sybarite, with his overflowing plume and schlong.
There it is.
How inconstant love can be, even a mother's, I discovered, as swift to fade as to bloom, not more than a drift of wayward spume. I could have killed the bugger thrice each day, each time he spurned the hard-won Kuru crown, which casuistry on duties to the dead. All hogwash, each syllable. My son gave less than a toss for ancestral fury, or his own immortal soul. Communion with the nearest quim was his soul-cherished goal.
Yeah.
French, we say en retour de bon procédé. So in exchange, I'd like to hear, because there's this fantastic thing. It's a lot about gender with Siren, and the female voices reclaiming their place, their truths. But it's also a lot about mortality in the face of divine impunity and divine capriciousness, the gods doing what they want and destroying all these other lives with absolutely no heed or conscience. And there's a beautiful reflection on actually the consequences to this immorality of the immortals, the fact that they are perhaps lacking in pleasure, which is by Tiresias, which I thought was the most wonderful, unforgettable passage maybe for me in the book. Would you?
Sure. So Tiresias, maybe you guys know, was invited by Juno and Jove to answer the question, who enjoys sex more? And so this is the moment where he's sort of standing, the way I have it is he's standing at the end of their bed, trying to figure out how to answer this question. The last bit of late afternoon light entered the window, and the massive mirror flung it onto the ceiling in a bolt of white. The mirror was framed with crude scenes carved into the gilt. A man and a horse, a woman on her knees, dozens of lean little cupids with menacing grins. On the wall on Juno's side of the bed, one of her moon phase paintings. Against the indigo, the crescents and swells had a white gold radiance. The paints of a goddess glow. In a heap on the floor, Jove's robe. Juno had kicked her sandals off as she'd walked into the bedroom door. These immortals, these two who will not know end, what do they know of pleasure? For us, earthbound, finite, for we who will die. To dissolve with another body is to brush against immortality. It is to be absorbed into an endlessness. We pursue these moments with so much of ourselves, joined with another body, in whole surrender, in total pleasure. We transcend temporarily our own eventual ends. We enter a place unbound by future or past. We enter into oblivion. We enter the infinity that death is, and we are alive to know it and exist within it for moments. One could argue, and perhaps I would, as a human on this earth, it is the profoundest of experiences offered up to us, woman or man or both or neither. The gods chase the same oblivion, but what breaks over us as a vast rush of eternity, they experience as the closest thing they can know to knowing what it is to die. It is the moment they come closest to mortality, and it explains their fascination with our mortal desire. They taste our ends, we taste their endlessness. In that, we are offered more. Our pleasure, harder won, we pay for it with our lives. In all our bodies, in all our states of being, we seek what does and does not bend to time. Thanks.
Sometimes I was wondering where you saw the most mature voices in your works. I saw it because sometimes this sense of reaction or rage or outrage is not yet a fully kind of individuated presence, female adult voice in a way where there's a whole range, where there's this developmental arc. So where I saw it was in the story Echo of yours, where this woman is this grown woman. She sees that her husband is imperfect, for number one, and then she takes out her rage on a number of other women, but she decides that it doesn't bring her, and this goes back to what you're just saying, a lot of happiness. It's more of a kind of a mature voice, I thought, at that point, because she sees the world as something almost sad in a way that her reactions, it just doesn't mitigate it. There's something deeper there for her at that moment.
Mm-hmm. And so are you saying that sort of the sort of as heightened rageful voices are less mature in your eyes?
They haven't gotten there yet. They're not balanced with other kinds of perspectives. It's a very more of a primitive thing. And so something happens, for me, I mean, this is an issue for male characters as well. Something happens and there's an arc there where there's a reaction, you try to reclaim something, but then you have to develop beyond that in a way. I don't know, but I did see there was those voices there that were coming through of your work.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that in yours as well? What are the most the kind of the coming of age female voice there?
Well, I think you should go first, because I think there was a question about Echo in particular.
Briefly, Echo. I mean, what's interesting about the Echo story? It's the one voice told from one of the sort of main pantheon. It's told from the voice of Juno, and what she is sort of expressing is that, like, she cannot kill her immortal husband for boning all these nymphs and raping all these nymphs, and sort of she can't kill him, and so she takes her anger out on the women that he seduces and rapes, and it's I don't know that I would call it more mature or developed. She is simply in a position as sort of one of the main goddesses to sort of be able to enact this one outletting of her anger and not another.
I also find it interesting that is the voice of the most powerful woman and one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon.
Mm-hmm.
So I did find that a really interesting counterpoint, the admission of a certain elemental helplessness,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
which is leading to this. That was for me, the takeaway from Echo's voice, which is not at all an Echo's voice.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But to come to Until the Lines, there are intersecting narratives, so you will see some of the same episodes or stories told through different actresses, and they are in various, in various positions on the maturity graph. And I think that's inevitable because it's about how much, it's also about distance. It's about how directly or not they were affected, and it's about how much agency they had or not. And sometimes that agency is just the agency of lucidity, of knowing why something happened. Like some of the most powerless voices are the ones that have the greatest clarity. So it's not necessarily related to age or closeness of experience either.
Thank you for wonderful reading and wonderful text. I'm going to push you a little bit, but actually both of you, but especially you, Nina. The hesitation of channeling, the hesitation in terms of there's a parallel universe, the unconscious universe, the notions of letting go, the notions of being in contact with ancestors.
Yeah.
For me as a non-Westerner, so-called Westerner, the world of the universe, tapping into the universe is something that for a lot of other people, it's real.
Totally.
Right? But also, if I could push,
Yes.
prior to monolithic sort of religions, the killing of the gods, the killing of the goddesses, how can we sort of interpret the way in which the ancient world, including India, has a way of telling stories about mortals that seems completely outwardly, but in which in the modern time we are embracing, but yet at the same time we are timid of embracing the ancient world of the magic, of the magical.
Right. Sure.
Without feeling kind of absurd.
Right. So this is okay. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Do you?
So the last thing, part of the reason I'm here is because Marilyn Harker told me that I have to come and listen to you. So yes, and I'm from Haiti, and of course voodoo
Yes.
has been completely destroyed, demonized by the West, and there is a lot of epic in there in which we have not been able to write about, right? And so this is why I came, so that I could learn from you to see how you've done this translation, and I love it. So anyway.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like, so I get shy sort of speaking this way, but it's also, it felt really real, and it felt really sort of, I think the way that I experience, I think some of these stories, they live in our bodies. They are in us. And I don't think I was quite aware of that when I was working on this. And I'm only just starting to feel aware of it now, that it's like it's not just like, oh, we have these stories in our brains. They live in our bodies, And I think that the sort of feeling of connection to your deepest interiority that goes back thousands of years, these stories. And I think what was striking to me too is that there's a lot of similarities in the details between these two books too. These are like, this isn't just like, oh, the West or the East. These are the sort of human stories. And it does feel, it's like, not like ghosts living in you, but sort of like that, and like, I love talking about this stuff. It feels new and interesting and compelling to me. And I also feel like, when you're like, yes, let's talk about it. I'm like, great, because I want to, because I do feel shy. And I do feel like, oh, when I say like, man, this was a physical experience. I was in like a trance state for 3 months, like feeling these characters. Like, I'm like, oh, Nina, shh. But so it's like, I don't know, but also like, that's possible, to be in conversation with it, and it's not history, it's like humanity, maybe is the word. Yeah.
So I'm just going to unpack a few of the things you said, which are constant interrogations. first hesitancy. I don't think it was hesitancy so much as uncertainty about the capacity to inhabit. Because all through the book, the only thing I was conscious of was not a reader, was not something else, but was about being faithful to each of the voices. And each voice is very different from mine. These are not experiences that I have had necessarily, or, in anybody in my immediate circle has. There's a great deal of what would ordinarily be projection, and the only way to attain that was actually internalize and not externalize with the projection. And therefore, I use the word inhabit very consciously. And again, yes, it's something we've lost, but I don't think it's related to the East or the West. I think it's about a certain, I'm not even sure if it is reality or a myth in itself, that we have as writers about control, because inhabiting also involves a loss of control.
Yeah.
And a loss of control is not something that you entirely want, because you also have, I don't mean to sound highfalutin, but there is also something like craft, and you do want to have that craft in your writing, because it's not, it's not stream of consciousness, or it's not unlimited in length and breadth and everything. So it's that balance, I think, which was the tightrope to achieve. And I've often wondered about that process every time it's happened, because it's not new. Perspectival tellings are not new. And while I was writing this, I also thought about people like Ovid again, but not Metamorphoses, but Heroides, where he writes his women, which, whom none of whom he was, but that whom he told so convincingly. And allowed me to think about, again, people that I would have normally never thought about. So I think it's maybe something that writers have had to deal with all through time. But you are right about, you're right about a lot of things, and in questioning us about it, but about this thing about perhaps the desire to avoid what is the cosmic voice or magic, because a lot of the tellings that I read, and during the course of those interminable 5.5 years, I did read everything I could get my hands on, and not just Asian epics, but everything, every single kind of myth, epic, legend, etc., including, say, the world of Marvel, because one of the best pieces of advice I had was read everything to do with war, with conflict, with violence, whichever part of the sphere it occupies. So I think there is a great deal of shyness around the irrational, and of course myth and legend occupy those spaces, and I think that's more to do with, and to come back to very specifically, a lot of the retellings that I read, say, written in the last 20 years, were attempts to rationalize. And one of the things I love about Siren is that even when you situate it in a 21st century context, there is no attempt to make this scientific. Or
Right.
A lot of the tellings I read they were trying to enter realms of science fiction, speculative fiction, and have technological or scientific responses to a god having a power. Nothing wrong with that, but it did make me think of what you just said, that we are so unwilling to tap into a huge legacy of magic and the realm of the irrational, which has formed the collective imagination.
So one of the concerns with the Mahabharata is that it's a part of your childhood almost. Tellings from your grandmother, or from things that you've read, or TV serials. So by the time you're 6, you've had so much that you've already read about it from so many perspectives. So as you wrote the book, did you kind of struggle with preconceived notions and conditioning that's so strong, which is even just growing up that you would have had, and was that something that you worked with?
It wasn't something to struggle with. It was just an enormous source of wealth, because even, like you said, by the time you're 6, you very specifically age 6, so you would have heard versions from your grandparents, your older cousins, your uncles, your aunts. That's how I first heard it. I first saw it much before I read it, through Kathakali performances, for instance. So there was performing art, classical performing art, also street performing art. So there's a there's a variety, there's an entire spectrum of ways in which you incorporate it, and they're all complementary. They're not monolithic at all. The TV, I was too young. The serialized versions actually came by the time I was a teenager, so they wouldn't have been as influential as oral tellings, performing art, and of course the inevitable Amar Chitra Katha. And there are these comics which at least 3 generations of Indians grew up with, and they covered the gamut of history, myth, folktale, everything. Like you had everything from the colonial struggle to the myths to the equivalent of Aesop's tales, the Panchatantra, etc. You could read everything in the Indian or the South Asian rather cosmogony through these comics. And they all had slightly different, perspectives, as you probably remember. So it wasn't a struggle. It was just an accumulation rather than anything else. Because there are so many, even when you watch the performing art forms, there are so many regional variations. And that's something I spoke about with BB Dates recently. She asked me pretty much the same thing. And she said, why was such and such translation important? Because I realized that depending on which part of the subcontinent you were from, which caste you were, which language you were writing it, which social kind of structure you came from, your telling inevitably changed in one way or the other. And so it was just, there was no struggle there. It was just, the question was what felt most right, most true to that particular character in the context that I was framing it in.
Cool. Great, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.